people who may not have been to the UK before, with a thumbs up. I've got a thumbs up from the back there, so that's great. I can confidently now say that the talk will be filmed and made available afterwards, as will the slides. But what we won't do, there's going to be a bit of Q&A, we'd like to get a bit of discussion going, but we won't be filming that, so you can sort of relax about that part of it. We do want to make this as kind of interactive and discursive as possible. After Harvey's spoken, please do kind of tweet your questions forward. Please contribute. Please do tweet your views as well. There is a hashtag. It's #OpenDataHE. Open data is lowercase HE, uppercase. If you don't want that to be used while you're asking a question or something, then please just say when you do ask a question. Otherwise, we'll assume that anybody can tweet about anything in the room. And also, there will be sort of an opportunity. There's going to be some drinks and refreshments afterwards, so there'll be an opportunity to come to stick around and talk to colleagues and participants afterwards. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Harvey Lewis, who's the Analytics Research Director at Deloitte, to deliver our talk. We're grateful that he's here. As well as his work for Deloitte, Harvey sits on the government's Open Data User Group, and he also led Deloitte's work on the market assessments of public sector data as part of the government's Shakespeare review. So I think certainly have a great deal of insight to offer, both from that perspective and how that applies to higher education. Before I do hand over, I just want to say a few words about the programme that we're developing at Universities UK with the Open Data Institute on open data. So those of you who were there at the previous talk would have heard a bit about this as an idea. I'm really pleased to say that we've been able to make some really good progress with that in terms of securing partners and securing funding for it. They've got a significant amount of money. We're very grateful to funding partners, JISC and the ITF supporting that. We're also grateful to the number of institutions that have signed up, either sort of fully signed up or in principle agreed to sign up to the programme to become members of the kind of founding partners. And those institutions that signed up are Edinburgh, Aberdeen, the Open University, Oxford, Southampton, Greenwich, and the NUS. And we're in discussions with some more. So we're very grateful to those institutions for their contributions. Now, on the back of that, on the back of the funding and the development we've done so far, we're in a really strong position to develop something which we think will hopefully value to the whole sector, and quite a substantial program. What we're going to be doing next is we'll be working with colleagues from the Open Data Institute over the summer in designing that program and putting together sort of the contents of it, and the funding partners will form a kind of core steering group. I think there'll be a number of components to it. We'll have a sort of thought leadership policy influencing element of it. So this is about how the sector can benefit from open data and how we can provide information to senior leaders, practitioners in the sector around this. There'll be a strand around sort of standards and capacity, about training skills, those kind of issues. And then there'll be a strand which is focused on applications. And so practical examples of how this can be used, and each of those three areas we need to do more work on to actually kind of freshen them out, but we will hopefully be able to be making further announcements on content in the early autumn, including sort of announcements on how you can all be involved, or a wider range of partners can be involved to help sort of shape and influence that. We'll also be continuing the seminar series into the autumn as well. So we'll have speakers certainly in September and October, and we're planning on doing a sort of slightly larger scale conference towards the end of the year or beginning of 2015. So this series will have a kind of break over the summer, and then we'll continue on through the autumn. And part of the purpose, I think, of what we're trying to do is get as many different sort of perspectives on the issues around open data and as far as they relate to the higher education sector, but also to make this as practical and useful as possible for those in the sector who are dealing with these issues, which takes me happily sort of back to where I started, which is we want to make this kind of as discursive and interactive as possible. So with that, I'm just going to just shut the door, and then I'm going to hand over to Harvey.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. As Paul said, I'm Harvey Lewis. I run the research program that Deloitte carries out into data and analytics, and I also have a couple of external appointments as well. So he's mentioned being a member of the Open Data User Group, which brokers data requests from users to government. I've also been asked by the Cabinet Office to support the setup of a new task force which encourages engagement between private sector and the public sector around open data. I also do a number of other things around the Open Government Partnership and support occasionally the Advisory Panel on Public Sector Information, which looks at the government's information in the round. And for someone who spends a lot of time in open data, please forgive the slightly casual look tonight. I didn't look up on TfL's website, but there are 175 steps from the platform at Russell Square Station to the surface, so I got quite warm in the process. So tonight I'm going to talk about three things, really. I'm going to talk about how the higher education sector can publish its data and the sort of benefits that can bring. I'm also going to talk about how it can use data that the government and other organisations provide. And I'm going to look at some of the steps that can be taken to start the ball rolling and some of the benefits that can accrue as a consequence. But before I start, I want to talk about this. This is my favourite subject. I have a degree in aeronautics and astronautics from Southampton University, a PhD in hypersonic aerodynamics, and I love everything to do with space and rockets. So no talk of mine is complete without a picture of a rocket. Now, you're wondering what the connection is, I'm sure. So this is NASA's New Horizons probe, which launched towards Pluto in 2006. And it's going to arrive there in July next year, about this time next year. It's a journey of about 5 billion kilometers, taking about 9.5 years. And I know you're wondering where I'm going with this. Okay, so now just take a different frame. Think about data. Last year, humans generated or replicated 4.4 zettabytes of data. And I don't know about you, but I struggle to understand what a zettabyte is, or even some of the newer terms like brontobyte and yottabyte. A zettabyte is 10 to the power 21. So it's a lot of zeros. Still very difficult to quantify. But if you were to take all of that data and convert it into text, ASCII text, and print it in grade A research journals, you would get a stack of journals that would stretch from the surface of the Earth to Pluto and back 30 times. That's how much 4.4 zettabytes of data is. And at the rate we're generating data, then that stack, if we could print it quickly enough, would reach from Earth to Pluto in 6 days. That's the rate we are currently generating data. So NASA's New Horizons probe, 9.5 years. Humans and big data, 6 days. So that's how much data there is. Now, not all of that is open, of course, but actually a considerable amount is. And when I first started looking at open data about 3 years ago, and I went to somewhere like data.gov.uk, there are about 5,000 data sets. If you went there today, there's about 20,000. In the UK, from just 3 portals, you can get your hands on over 40,000 data sets. That's open data, completely open. Worldwide, there are more than 8 million data sets that are curated by organisations like Quandl, Data Catalogs, Socrata, you name it. There are huge quantities of open data out there from hundreds of countries around the world. And there are a growing number of international as well as national efforts to promote open data. So I've already mentioned the Open Government Partnership. We have things like the Open Data Institute in this country and a lot of other government structures that are designed to promote open data. And elsewhere we have the Open Data Index, we have the Web Barometer, we have a huge number of initiatives, all of which are designed to put data out there to make it more transparent. So what's the value of this data? Well, according to Lateral Economics, they've just published a report which says for the G20, over the next 5 years, cumulative value is, it's about $13 trillion, 7.6 trillion pounds. That's a huge number. I mean, it's enormous. Now, we can sort of work backwards. If you look at McKinsey's report, which was published earlier this year, on open data, they estimated about $3 trillion worldwide, 1.75 trillion pounds. Still very, very big numbers. Apologies to those of you at the back of the room who are now struggling to see the dots. The Vickery report, Graham Vickery produced something for the EU, looking just the EU, which estimated £32 billion per annum. And as part of the Shakespeare review, which Paul mentioned, if you need to wear glasses, then you might need to put them on to see the dot. The work we did for the Shakespeare review estimated that in 2011, the value of public sector information in the UK was about £6.8 billion. So that's a really, really tiny proportion compared to 7.6 trillion, but nevertheless, its value shouldn't be underestimated. And these are really conservative estimates. And to a large extent, depend on two things: the direct impacts that open data can have on the economy, that the wages, the taxes, those sorts of things, as well as the things that you buy as a consequence of open data, so some of the apps that might be developed. But the most important contributor that open data makes to the economy is in the wider societal benefits. So it's things like the London bus app or the TfL journey app. How many of you have got that app on your phones? So that sort of application, which uses free open data from TfL, improves productivity because it means you're not spending as much time waiting for tubes, waiting for buses. There are other initiatives. I mean, the Open Data Institute itself, working with an organisation called Mastodon C, looked at prescribing data, which is published in England. And they estimated that the amount of money spent, additional money spent on patented statins, one of the most common drugs prescribed for lowering blood pressure, was about 200 million per annum. So compared to generic drugs, there's a huge amount of saving that can be made here. So the value which is locked into data is mainly to do with wider societal impacts rather than the direct impacts, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And of course, higher education is already open. And this is sort of my challenge to universities. So if you look at MOOCs, massively open online courses, the take-up is increasing significantly. There's course content available online from a number of different universities and other providers, Coursera being one of the main ones. So the challenge for universities in this environment, an increasingly competitive environment, is how can you make use of data, both your own data and other organisations' data, to retain that competitive advantage. In many ways, MOOCs are a bit like Netflix. So Netflix versus traditional media organisations. So hoovering up huge quantities of data about the students who are taking their courses and then configuring those courses on the fly to suit the needs of their students. So that's a similar sort of challenge. How do you operate in a world where the content can be created dynamically and tailored for individuals? And this is, I think, one of the greatest benefits of both open and big data, is it allows you to take the big picture, but the sufficient quantities of data that allow you then to tailor it and zero in on individuals and make it relevant for individuals. So that is really what the MOOC challenge is about, is for universities, how do you make it relevant to students? So there's a lot of data out there. And this is just a list that I put together very, very quickly. If you think about all of the sources of data that universities hold, the data that they collect as part of their administrative functions and operating activity, as well as the data that they have access to and collect specifically as part of the work they do, so research data versus admissions data, for example. There's huge quantities, and all of it is really very valuable. But for me, when it comes to open data work, you should never start with the data. And actually, it's a lot better to think about who benefits. who are the audiences for this data and who are the stakeholders that are going to benefit from use of the data. And actually, when you look at it this way, that allows you to put a completely different complexion on the data sets that are available. And the universities have a fantastic and key role in local economies. Not just about students, but it's also about the local community that lives in the environment, both residential and business, and the contribution that the universities can make to those. Universities, of course, have got students, so there's a set of data here that can support learning, that can support the day-to-day activities that students undertake. There's data that can support staff activities, visitors. A huge array of data that can be used in a number of innovative and interesting ways. And there are plenty of examples. And these are just some of them. And actually, I did a tour of various university websites looking at the data they make available. And a large number of them actually are, starting quite simple, maps of the campus. Whether that's satellite imagery or that's traditional maps, where are the buildings, what courses are taught in those buildings, just making it easier for people to get around. And I, for one, remember being a fresher, really struggling with my timetable when I got it and wondering where on earth I had to be. And just simple information like that is incredibly useful. But also other examples. So the University of Southampton, for example, curates a list of equipment that universities use within their department. So you can go onto a website, you can say, I need a mass spectrometer, or I need a high-power welding laser. You type that in, and it pops a list of those facilities and where they are around the country. So that sort of thing maybe starts to support collaboration where it might not have existed before. Also helps people understand where there might be a shortfall in equipment as far as research or teaching is concerned. Elsewhere in universities around the world, there are other great initiatives. So in the University of New Mexico, for example, they had a set of open data. What they did is they ran, what is nowadays referred to as a hackathon, where they provided students and other people with data and said, well, what can you make of with this data? And over a weekend, a number of applications have been developed on the back of that. So the use of the crowd open innovation is always one thing that really helps to engage. And I think one of the main messages here about this data, and we do another survey actually of the public's attitudes towards the collection and use of data, and that says that if you are transparent, if you open up your data, you build trust. People are between 2 and 3 times more likely to trust you if they know what data is collected about them, how it's used, and if you start to engage them in the process with data. And the local community, students, they all benefit when this data is published. There's great advantage in publishing data. And of course, organisations like the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HEFKI, and others, they are publishing aggregated data. They're taking feeds from all the universities, and they've got a plentiful supply of data. And our member firm in the Netherlands works with the equivalent authorities over there, and they're looking at questions like, how do you tell whether or not a student is going to fail? What sort of background contributes to that failure? So if you can identify those sorts of things in advance, then what are the interventions, what are the steps that you can take to make sure that that student doesn't ultimately end up failing or walking out? And of course, revenue is a significant driver of some of those decisions. So the earlier you're able to spot these things, then potentially the more money you're able to save, the greater amount of revenue that you bring in. And our colleagues in Australia are doing something very similar. And this is all built on openly available data. So there's a great opportunity from the data that universities publish for then looking inwards at what can I do to improve efficiency, how can I improve operational effectiveness, how do I take what I do day to day in my operations and just make it better using open data. And I think that's one of the great opportunities that exists. So the other question is then, for universities, how do I hoover up all of this data and make use of it? And as I said before, there's a great quantity of data out there. We did this study 2 years ago now, looking at the data sets that were available on data.gov.uk, on the ONS's official portal, and the London Data Store. And we looked at 37,500 data sets, give or take. And we broke down those data sets into a number of different categories that you can see on the screen. So actually, by and large, the greatest contributor to open data at the time was government spending data. Huge spreadsheets that were made available on everything that the government was spending in central government departments or local authorities. The economy and data about the economy is second. Demographics, huge contributor to certainly a lot of the projects that I run. Health and social care, the labour market, environment, government operations, population health, education, crime and justice, and so on. And the size of the bubbles here gives you an indication of the quantity of data that is linked to that category. And on the right-hand side, we got from these portals the number of downloads of this data. So we're able to look and quantify the demand for the data. And actually, you start to see some really interesting disparities. So even though the largest amount of data available is government spending data, the economy, data about the economy, is what is being demanded from the audiences, and demographics as well. So there's a large chunk of data which is demanded and also provided, which provides information not just about failing students, which is the example I've just had, but where do students go in the future? How do I align what I teach, what I research in universities, to either the local, the national, or the international labour market? Those are sort of very good questions that help to improve take-up rates and operating effectiveness. Of course, this doesn't show up too well on the screen, but it's very difficult to look at data sets in isolation. So another study we did was just to look at how different data sets are related to each other. So a good example here is health and people and employment. So for example, what we're doing here is the proximity of these bubbles, which describe each bubble is a different data set or a different tag associated with the data set. When they're close together, these are data sets that contain both those sorts of information. When they're far apart, they have nothing to do with each other. So when we look at this sort of diagram, we can start to see actually that health and employment are closely related. Education and people are closely related. Whereas health, and down here in this corner here, fish information are not related. And I love this diagram actually, because that bubble on the bottom right-hand side, each bubble is a different type of fish that you find in our territorial waters. And this poor fella up here, that's worm. So the worm is linked to all of the different types of fish, presumably because worms are used as bait. So it's quite a funny example, but it illustrates how important it is to understand connections between data sets when making decisions about how you can use them. So if you have a question, and I'll come on to questions in a second, which you want answered by open data, it's really important to be able to say, well, what data sets are going to be relevant to that question, which is the purpose of doing this sort of analysis. But the really interesting aspect of my job is that I don't just focus on one sector. I look across all sectors, using open data, not using open data, but always using data. And this, for me, is the most important message when it comes to data use. Is it's very easy to think about open data in particular as being a pure play, and by that I mean you build applications, you build tools and solutions which take one data set or maybe a couple of data sets, and you focus a benefit on just those. In reality, and certainly what we find within our organization and within private sector clients, is where the value comes from is by bringing in many different data sets, some of which are open, some of which you hold internally, some of which you pay for, others like social media that are somewhere in between. And the reason you do this is because your data is incredibly rich and detailed about the things that matter to you. Typically, open data gives you a bigger picture. It provides the context in which your data sits. So when you bring the two together, you end up with a much better informed view of the world and of your data, actually. So we're doing an awful lot of work here helping organizations do exactly this. So with the banks, for example, we've been looking at what is going to change in the future of branch banking in the next 5 to 10 years. And to do that, we've brought together open data, about 10 or 15 different data sets, including demographic information, business information, survey data on online banking and penetration of the internet. But also we've brought in data, we've used some of our data, and we've used some of the bank's data. Put that all into a big hopper and then analyze the outcome. So actually that is one of the great uses of open data. Don't just think about its use on its own, think about how it can complement and contribute to studies that you might be doing with your own data, for example. So this is something I use to sort of start the conversation really with a lot of our clients, because everyone says, well, there's a lot of data, there's some fantastic technology that I can use, so surely I must be able to do something. And actually the first step is never to look at the data, we've already covered that one. It's never to look at the technology, it's always to identify the objective or the question that you're seeking to ask. And that's so important because if you do otherwise, then actually there's a very great risk that whatever activities you do undertake will fail. If you identify the question, that really crystallizes the views that you need to take on both data and technology and a number of other things. And it's only once you've understood that question or that objective that you can then move forward to assess that technology and data landscape, to understand the capabilities that you require as an organization, and then whether or not you need to maybe start with a pilot or a prototype to see how it works before really rolling this out and scaling it up. But I will always come back to the question as being the most important thing. And I'll touch on it again at the end, but it's the characteristics of those questions which drive the use of open data and data more generally. Is it focused? Is it clear? Is it aligned to one of your strategic objectives or to a process that you want to improve in terms of efficiency? Can you measure what things are like now and what things will be like in the future once you've tried this new process? These are fundamental questions to start with before moving on in any other direction. And then you've got to remember this, which is a classic problem actually, is it's very easy for people like me to stand up and get very excited about technology and data. I mean, my job's been described as perhaps the most fantastic job in Deloitte, and I guess if you're a data geek, that's true. But it is nevertheless incredibly enjoyable because I can dip into data sets, I can use different technologies and have a great time. The problem is that data and technology is just the tip of the iceberg. The technology in particular is just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that are the questions and everything else that needs to be asked. But there are also things like a strategy for doing this sort of thing and for doing it well. It's about people and making sure that you have the right organizational structure, the right skills and talent within the organization to be able to deliver against that strategy. Have I got the right processes? And that includes things like governance around the data and the technology and ownership of it, particularly if you're using open data or publishing open data, and making sure that you are compliant with relevant legislation and regulations, with your own codes of conduct, with ethical practices, and so on. It does include the data, but data from a data management perspective. About 50% of my time on projects is spent on doing nothing but managing data. have I got the right data? Is it right accuracy and quality? Where do I put it? How do I organize it? Is it backed up? All of those questions and those activities take a huge amount of time. And this isn't me trying to scare you off using data, but I think it's really important to understand that there are a set of fundamentals associated with the use of data in practice when you apply it that need to be got right before you can go for the nice shiny bit that's above water. And that's so fundamental. So I'm just going to polish off now with another picture of a rocket. I mean, it wouldn't be a presentation for me without another picture of a rocket. And I think this is going to take you back to one of the key points I've already made in the talk this afternoon, which is in the 1960s, JFK stood up and he said, "We choose to go to the moon." Now that's a really interesting statement because he didn't say, "We choose to build the world's most powerful liquid-fueled rocket." And if he had said that, which he could well have done, he probably wouldn't have inspired a nation or the world. What he did is he set the objective. He inspired people by setting out where it was he was going. And that's the same thing with open data. So if we look at that rocket, the Saturn V, and we say the technology, the analytics technology and everything else we need is the rocket. And all of the data that we could use, open or otherwise, is the fuel. Those two things do come together to make something which is truly extraordinary. But on their own, they're just a big firework. And unless you've got somewhere to go, you've got a question to answer, a strategic objective to achieve, then it's almost completely worthless. And actually, if you do want better quality answers that you can use to drive efficiency, to improve effectiveness, to improve student retention, recruitment, research, then you need to ask a better quality question. That's all I've got to say this afternoon. So please do feel free to ask any questions and we'll get a bit of a discussion going.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. It's a huge amount of very rich and useful content in there. And so there are some things that that I'm very interested in. But before I start off, I'm just very happy to open up and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to start.